The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn leather of her boots and the threadbare wool of her tunic, sinking deep into her bones until she was sure her marrow had turned to ice. Alara's hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding from the harsh lye soap and the endless, frigid water of the scullery. She was an Omega, a ghost in the Grey Fang Pack's halls, visible only when someone needed something to blame or something to clean. She scrubbed at a stubborn stain on the stone floor, her breath pluming in the damp air. Hunger was another companion, a dull, persistent ache in the pit of her stomach that never truly went away. She was given scraps, leftovers, whatever the pack dogs turned their noses up at. Worthless. The word was a brand on her soul, whispered in the corridors and spat at her feet. She was an orphan from a shamed line, a stray taken in not from kindness, but for the convenience of having a creature with no status to do the work no one else wanted. A shadow fell over her. Alara didn't need to look up to know who it was. The cloying scent of winter rose perfume always announced Lyra's arrival. "Still scrubbing, little mouse?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with crushed glass. She was the Alpha's daughter, beautiful and cruel, her silver blonde hair a stark contrast to Alara's own mud-brown tangles. Alara kept her eyes down, her knuckles white as she pushed the brush back and forth. Acknowledging Lyra only ever made it worse. A silk-slippered foot kicked the wooden bucket beside her. Icy, filthy water sloshed over the floor, soaking the hem of Alara's tunic and splashing against her legs. The shock of the cold was so intense it felt like a burn. "Oops," Lyra said, the word dripping with false sympathy. "How clumsy of me. You'll have to do that all over again. Make sure it's perfect this time. We can't have the Supreme Alpha arriving to a filthy keep." Alara's jaw tightened. The Alpha King. Kale. His name was a legend, a whispered myth of power and ancient lineage. He ruled all the packs of the North from his mountain throne, a king so old and mighty that the regional alphas like Lyra's father were mere chieftains in his shadow. His visit was the only thing anyone had spoken of for weeks. "He'll want everything spotless," Lyra continued, circling Alara like a predator. "And you, little mouse, will be kept in the cellars where you belong. We can't have your stench offending him." The humiliation was a hot, bitter thing in her throat. She fought back the sting of tears. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. Not now, not ever. This was her one small rebellion, to endure, to not break where they could see. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Lyra prodded Alara's shoulder with the toe of her slipper. "Or are you just too stupid to speak?" Alara gritted her teeth, the sound of faint scrape in the quiet scullery. She pushed herself to her feet, her whole body aching, and reached for the bucket. She would refill it. She would clean the floor again, and again if she had to. She would survive this day, just as she had survived all the others. Lyra let out a tinkling, unpleasant laugh. Pathetic. She turned and swept from the room, leaving Alara alone with the spreading puddle and the bone-deep cold. Alara stood there for a long moment, trembling not just from the chill, but from the contained fury. Worthless. Pathetic. The words echoed in the empty space of her mind, but beneath them, a tiny, stubborn spark flickered. It was the memory of her mother's smile, the feeling of her father's strong hand in hers before they were taken by the fever. They had loved her. She had not been worthless to them. That spark was all she had left. She clung to it as she righted the bucket and headed back to the pump, the icy air slicing at her wet clothes like 1,000 tiny claws. The blizzard arrived without warning. a howling white monster that descended from the mountains and swallowed the world. The winds shrieked, rattling the shutters of the keep and piling snow in great drifts against the walls. It was a storm of unnatural fury, the kind the elders spoke of in hushed tones, a physical manifestation of the wild magic of the north. And it was in the heart of this storm that Alpha Alaric, Lyra's father, found Alara. He was a hard man with cruel eyes, and he looked at her with a particular kind of distaste, as if her very presence was an insult. "You," he barked, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "The healers need frost fern for the king's welcoming poultices. The stores are empty. It only grows at the base of the weeping crag." Alara's blood ran cold. The weeping crag was half a league into the forest, a treacherous place even in good weather. In this blizzard, it was a death sentence. This was not an errand. It was an execution. A quiet, convenient way to be rid of the pack's unwanted burden before the Alpha King's arrival. "But Alpha," she began, her voice a reedy whisper. "Do you dare question me?" Alaric's hand shot out, and his fingers wrapped around her arm in a bruising grip. Pain flared, sharp and immediate. "You will go, or you will be whipped. The choice is yours." There was no choice. There never was. He thrust a thin, patched cloak and a small basket into her hands. "Do not return without it." The unspoken words hung in the air. Do not return at all. He released her, shoving her toward the service door. The moment she pulled it open, the storm clawed at her, trying to tear the door from her grasp. It was a wall of roaring wind and blinding snow. Stepping into it felt like stepping off the edge of the world. The forest was a nightmare of shifting white and screaming wind. Alara bent her head, pulling the inadequate cloak tighter. The snow was up to her knees in moments, and every step was a monumental effort. The cold was no longer a companion. It was an active predator, stealing the warmth from her body, the breath from her lungs. She lost the path within minutes. Every direction looked the same, a churning vortex of white. Was she going toward the crag, or deeper into the endless, frozen woods? She didn't know. Her face was numb, her fingers and toes long past aching. A heavy lethargy began to settle over her, a dangerous, seductive whisper that told her to just lie down, to rest in the soft, white snow, to sleep. No. The spark. The stubborn, tiny spark of defiance flared. She would not die like this. She would not give Alaric and Lyra the satisfaction. She forced one leg in front of the other, her movements clumsy and slow. She was fueled by nothing but sheer, desperate will. Then the ground vanished beneath her feet. She cried out, a sound swallowed by the gale as she tumbled down a steep, snow-covered embankment. She rolled, momentum carrying her until she crashed into something hard. For a moment, she lay there, dazed, the wind howling above her. She had fallen into a shallow ravine, somewhat sheltered from the worst of the storm. Pain throbbed in her shoulder where she'd hit the rock. Pushing herself up, she saw a dark shape huddled against the rock face, a deeper black against the gray twilight of the storm. It was huge. At first, she thought it was a bear, but the shape was wrong, more canine. It was a wolf. A wolf larger than any she had ever seen, its fur the color of a moonless night. Its massive head was resting on its paws, and a dark, ugly stain marred the thick fur of its flank. Blood. A low growl rumbled from its chest as she shifted, a sound like stones grinding together. Its head lifted, and even in the dim light, she saw its eyes. They were not the yellow or brown of a normal wolf. They were a liquid, burning gold, filled with ancient pain and simmering power. Fear, sharp and primal, lanced through her. This was no ordinary animal. This was one of the great wolves of the north, a creature of myth. And it was wounded. Badly. Another low growl, weaker this time, ended in a pained whine. Her fear warred with a different, deeper instinct, an empathy so profound it was almost a physical ache. The creature was in agony. She could feel it, a resonance in her own bones. The errand, the cold, her own impending death, it all faded away. All that existed was this magnificent, dying creature and the overwhelming urge to help. Slowly, cautiously, she began to crawl toward it. "Easy," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor. "I'm not going to hurt you." The great wolf watched her approach, its golden eyes narrowed. The growl in its chest was a constant vibration. It was a warning, but it lacked conviction. It was too weak to be a real threat. She was a fool. This was suicide. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to flee and take her chances with the storm. But her body wouldn't obey. She was drawn forward by an invisible cord, a pull she could not explain or resist. She was only a few feet away now. She could smell the sharp, metallic tang of its blood and the clean, wild scent of pine and winter that clung to its fur. She reached the wolf's side. The wound was worse than she'd thought. It was a deep gash, black and festering at the edges, oozing a dark, viscous substance. It looked like it had been caused by a poisoned blade. Without thinking, driven only by that deep, inexplicable compassion, she reached out a trembling hand. She had to do something. She had to touch it, to offer what little comfort she could, even if it was the last thing she ever did. Her raw, cold fingers brushed against the hot fur near the edge of the wound. The world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a silent detonation of energy that erupted from the point of contact. A wave of searing heat and blinding white light slammed through her, overloading every one of her senses. A scream was torn from her throat as a specific, agonizing pain centered on her left wrist. It felt as if a hot iron was being pressed into her skin, burning her down to the bone. She fell back, clutching her arm, her vision swimming with white spots. The entire ravine seemed to hum with a powerful, ancient energy. The air crackled. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard a sound that was not the wind, a deep, guttural groan of pain and something else, something like release. Blinking away the light, her gaze snapped back to where the wolf had been. It was gone. In its place, a man was rising to his knees. He was huge, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, even in his weakened state. His tangled, dark hair fell around a face that was harsh, beautiful, and predatory. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that looked like it was made for command. He was naked, his skin pale in the dim light, his body a roadmap of scars, old and new. The gash on his side was still there, but it was no longer black and festering. The poison was gone, leaving only clean, red blood. He looked at her, and his eyes were the same molten gold as the wolf's. They burned with an intensity that pinned her in place, stripping her bare, seeing not the worthless Omega, but something deep inside her she didn't even know was there. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. He was a giant, a colossus of muscle and latent power. Alara felt like a field mouse staring up at an eagle. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrified drumbeat. His gaze dropped from her face to her left arm, which she was still cradling against her chest. He took a step closer, then another. Terrified, she scrambled backward, but her wounded shoulder protested, and she winced. He stopped. His golden eyes flickered with an emotion she couldn't name. Slowly, as if not to startle her, he lifted a hand and pointed. His voice, when he spoke, was a deep rumble that vibrated through the very ground. It was not a question. It was a pronouncement, a claim. Mine. Alara followed his gaze. She unfurled her fingers from her wrist. There, burned onto her skin, was a mark. It was an intricate, swirling spiral of silvery lines, delicate as a spiderweb but glowing with a soft internal light. It looked like a stylized wolf howling at a crescent moon. It was beautiful, and it was a part of her now, a brand seared into her flesh. What was happening? Who was this man? Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and utter confusion. He was the wolf. The wolf was him. The touch. The mark. He took another slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're her," he breathed, the words laced with a century of disbelief and aching certainty. "After all this time, you." Her. Who was her? She was Alara. She was no one, nothing. A worthless scullery maid with frozen feet and a new, terrifying brand on her arm. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear. This man was power incarnate. He was danger. He was the storm given human form. But her body betrayed her. It didn't want to run. A strange, unfamiliar warmth was spreading through her veins, originating from the glowing mark on her wrist. It was a pull, a deep, resonant hum that recognized him. It felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Her soul was straining toward him, even as her mind recoiled in fear. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the terror and the dawning instinctual recognition. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space, though his entire posture screamed with the need to close the distance, to touch her again, to claim what the magic had just declared his. "I will not harm you," he said, his voice softer now, though still carrying that immense weight of command. "I have been waiting for you." Waiting for her? The idea was so ludicrous it bordered on madness. No one had ever waited for her, except to give her an order or a beating. She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. I don't understand." His smile was a faint, harsh curve of his lips, but it transformed his face. The predatory sharpness softened into something breathtaking. "I know, but you will." His gaze fell to his own body, to his nakedness and the still bleeding wound in his side. A flicker of something, vulnerability perhaps, crossed his features before being suppressed. He was powerful, yes, but he was also injured and exposed in a deadly storm. And he had saved her, in a way. The fall would have stunned her, left her to freeze. His presence, the strange, magical event, had shocked her back to full awareness. Her fear was still a living thing inside her. But the overwhelming empathy she'd felt for the wolf now extended to the man. He was hurt. He was cold. Hesitantly, she pushed herself to her feet. She unwrapped the thin, patched cloak from her own shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Holding it out, she took a shaky step toward him. He watched her, his golden eyes tracking her every movement. He stood perfectly still as she approached, letting her come to him. She reached him and, with trembling fingers, draped the small cloak around his massive shoulders. It was absurdly small on him, barely covering his torso. Her fingers brushed his skin. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and energy that made her gasp. The mark on her wrist pulsed with light. His eyes flared, turning from gold to molten silver. A low sound escaped his throat, a possessive growl of pure satisfaction. The intensity was too much. She snatched her hand back as if burned. He didn't move to stop her. He simply looked down at the pathetic cloak, then back at her, his expression unreadable. He had been dying, poisoned and freezing. Now the poison was gone, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature was spreading through him, emanating from the bond that had finally, impossibly, snapped into place. "We need to get out of the storm," he stated, his voice regaining its strength. He looked around the small ravine, then up at the howling whiteness above. Alara just stared at him. Go where? Back to the keep? Back to Alaric and Lyra? The thought filled her with a familiar dread, but it was now complicated by a new, sharp terror. What would they do when they saw him? When they saw the mark on her arm? As if reading her thoughts, he reached out, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't touch her. Instead, his fingers gently took the edge of her sleeve and pulled it down, covering the glowing mark. His gaze met hers, and in their depths, she saw a promise of protection. "You are with me now," he said, the words an unbreakable vow. "No one will ever harm you again." He then tore a strip from the bottom of her tattered cloak, the fabric ripping with a soft sound. He knelt, his movements still stiff with pain, and began to clean the edges of his own wound. It was a clumsy, difficult angle. Alara watched for a moment before her innate practicality took over. She knelt in the snow in front of him, taking the strip of cloth from his hand. Her touch was hesitant, but her movements were sure. She had tended to cuts and scrapes on the pack's children and hounds when no one else would bother. She worked in silence, her head bowed, focusing on the task. Her small, raw hands were a stark contrast against his scarred, pale skin. She was intensely aware of him, of his size, of the heat rolling off his body, of the way his golden eyes watched her every move. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply let her tend to him, his breathing the only sound in the small shelter of the ravine. She finished, tying the cloth as a makeshift bandage. It was a poor effort, but it was better than nothing. When she was done, she kept her head down, unable to meet his gaze. She was a scullery maid, touching this magnificent, terrifying being as if she had the right. He reached out and placed 2 fingers under her chin, gently forcing her to look up at him. His touch was a paradox, infinitely gentle yet unyieldingly firm. It sent another shock of warmth through her. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Alara," she whispered. "Alara," he repeated, and the sound of her own name on his tongue was a revelation. He said it not like the curse everyone else did, but like something precious. "I am Kale." Kale, the Alpha King. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just with a mythical creature. She was with the mythical creature, the supreme alpha of the North. The man Lyra and her father were so desperate to impress. The man they were going to hide her from. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. She tried to pull back, but his fingers held her fast. "There is nothing to fear," he murmured, his thumb stroking her jaw. "Not from me." But there was. There was everything to fear. Her, an Omega, branded by the Alpha King? They would not see it as a blessing. They would see it as an abomination, a stain on his honor. They would kill her for it. Kale's expression hardened as he read the terror on her face. He rose to his full, towering height, pulling her up with him. He took the larger, warmer cloak he had been given, her cloak, and wrapped it around her shoulders, enclosing her in its meager warmth and his overwhelming scent of pine and power. "It is time we returned," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I have things to discuss with Alpha Alaric." The journey back was a blur. Kale seemed to know the way instinctively, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own body. The storm was already beginning to lessen, its fury spent. Or perhaps it simply bent to his will. With him, anything felt possible. When the lights of the Grey Fang Keep appeared through the swirling snow, Alara's heart sank. This was it. The end of her life, one way or another. Kale didn't bother with the service door. He walked straight to the main gates, Alara a small trembling figure in his shadow. The guards on the wall shouted in alarm, and the heavy gates groaned open. They stepped into the torchlit courtyard. Pack members, drawn by the commotion, poured out of the great hall. A hush fell over the crowd as they took in the sight. The half-naked, bloodied giant of a man and the scullery maid huddled in his cloak. Alpha Alaric pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into dread as he recognized his king. He dropped to one knee. "My king!" He took a protective step in front of Alara. "You will be silent," he commanded, and the sheer force of his voice made Lyra flinch back as if struck. But her sharp eyes had already seen it. In the shifting torchlight, as Kael moved, the sleeve of Alara's tunic had ridden up slightly. Lyra's gaze locked onto the faint, silvery glow on Alara's wrist. The sneer on Lyra's face vanished. It was replaced by a look of stunned comprehension, which quickly curdled into something dark and calculating. Her eyes flickered from the mark to Kael, then back to Alara. She was no longer looking at a worthless rival. She was looking at a tool, a key, a weakness. Alara saw the shift in Lyra's expression, and a cold dread, worse than any blizzard, settled deep in her gut. This was not over. It was just beginning. Kael, his focus entirely on protecting Alara from the hostile crowd, missed the venomous calculation in Lyra's eyes. He swept Alara up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The crowd parted before him as he strode into the great hall, leaving a stunned, silent courtyard in his wake. He did not stop until he reached the chambers that had been prepared for him. They were the finest in the keep, with a roaring fire and thick furs piled on the bed. He set her down gently before the hearth, his body a solid wall between her and the door. "Sit," he commanded, his voice softer again. "Get warm." Alara sank onto a fur rug, her whole body trembling with shock and exhaustion. She stared into the flames, the silver mark on her wrist pulsing with a steady, reassuring heat. his mate. The words were impossible, a fairy tale for a girl who had only ever known nightmares. Kael was still weak. The poison and the cold had taken their toll, even on his immense strength. He sank onto a chair, his head falling into his hands for a moment, a rare show of weariness. He needed to rest, to heal. He posted his own personal guards, 2 grim-faced warriors who had traveled with him, outside his door. He believed he was safe. He believed she was safe. He underestimated the depths of betrayal that festered in the Grey Fang pack. That night, as Alara drifted in a restless sleep on a pile of furs near the fire, the trap was sprung. A shout echoed from the far end of the keep, followed by the clash of steel. A diversion. Kael's guards tensed, exchanging a look. One of them moved to investigate, leaving only a single warrior at the door. Moments later, the door to the chamber burst open. It was not Kael's guard. It was Alpha Alaric and 3 of his largest pack warriors. The lone guard loyal to Kael was cut down before he could even draw his sword. Alara scrambled backward, a scream catching in her throat. Kael was on his feet in an instant, a snarl ripping from his chest. But he was still injured, his movements slower than they should have been. As he moved to intercept Alaric, 2 more figures slipped into the room from a tapestry-covered side door. Lyra. And with her, a man cloaked in shadow, his face obscured, who radiated a cold, malevolent power that made the fire in the hearth sputter and dim. "Take her," Lyra hissed. Before Kael could react, before Alara could even scream, one of Alaric's men lunged, clamping a hand over her mouth. Another grabbed her arms, and she felt the cold, slick touch of metal against her skin. Silver. Thick, silver manacles were snapped onto her wrists, covering the bond mark. The moment the silver closed over her skin, the warmth in her veins vanished. The connection to Kael, that humming, vibrant chord, was brutally severed. The silence in her soul was a physical pain, a tearing agony that was 1,000 times worse than the cold or the hunger. She cried out, but the sound was muffled against the warrior's hand. Across the room, Kael roared. It was a sound of pure, untamed fury and agony. He felt the bond snap, felt her terror and her pain as if it were his own. He launched himself at Alaric, but the shadowy figure with Lyra moved. He raised a hand, and a bolt of black energy, crackling and foul, struck Kael in the chest. Kael staggered back, clutching his chest, his golden eyes wide with shock and pain. The dark magic sizzled, momentarily disrupting his own formidable power. "The Covenant sends its regards, old wolf," the cloaked man said, his voice a dry rasp. It was all the time they needed. Alara was dragged backward, her feet stumbling on the furs, her eyes locked with Kael's for one desperate, agonizing moment. She saw his fury, his helplessness, and a pain that mirrored her own. Then a rough sack was thrown over her head, plunging her into suffocating darkness. She was hauled from the room, her struggles useless against the brute strength of her captors. The last thing she heard was Kael's enraged, heartbroken roar echoing through the keep. She was taken out into the raging storm again, thrown over the back of a horse like a sack of grain. The journey was a brutal, jarring nightmare. The silver cuffs felt like they were burning her skin, not with heat, but with a deadening cold that leached the life from her. The bond was a phantom limb, an aching void in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Despair, cold and absolute, began to consume her. She had had one moment, one fleeting, impossible moment of warmth, of being seen, of mattering. And now it was gone. She was back to being worthless, only now she was not just a tool for a cruel Alpha's daughter, but a pawn in a game of kings and shadows. They traveled for what felt like days. When they finally stopped, she was dragged from the horse and her feet found stone. The air was frigid and smelled of old rock and decay. The sack was pulled from her head. She stood in a vast, dark cavern lit by sickly green torches that cast long, dancing shadows. In the center of the cavern was a massive black stone altar, carved with disturbing, jagged runes. Hooded figures lined the walls, their faces lost in the gloom. This was the heart of the Ember Covenant. And standing before the altar was the man from Cale's chamber. He pulled back his hood. His face was pale and gaunt, with eyes that were black pits of ambition. This was Lord Malachor, a rival alpha from the blighted southern territories, a sorcerer who practiced forbidden magic. The Shadow King. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his pale face. "Welcome, little key," he said, his voice slithering through the cold air. "Your arrival has been long awaited." He circled her, his black eyes fixed on the silver manacles that bound her. A soul bond, the rarest of magics. Cale was always sentimental, a weakness I have been waiting centuries to exploit. Alara stared at him, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. "What do you want with me?" Malachor laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "With you? Nothing. You are a vessel, a conduit. That bond, the one you feel aching even now, is a gateway to his very soul, to his power. The fools who have tried to kill him over the ages never understood. You cannot destroy a king like Cale with a blade." He gestured to the altar. "But with the right ritual, one can corrupt the bond, siphon it, turn his greatest strength into his undoing. I will drain him through you, little key. I will take his power, his throne, his life, and you will be the instrument of his destruction." His words were a physical blow, to be used to destroy the one person who had ever looked at her with anything but contempt. It was a cruelty so profound it stole the air from her lungs. This was her worth, to be a weapon, to bring ruin to the man who had called her his. The despair was absolute. It crushed her. She hung her head, the fight draining out of her completely. Malachor was right. She was worthless. She was a curse. She was chained to the cold stone floor at the foot of the altar, left alone in the echoing darkness. The hooded figures were gone. The silence was a heavy blanket. The aching void where the bond had been was a constant torment. In the depths of her misery, a thought surfaced, a memory of his voice. "You are with me now. No one will ever harm you again." A broken promise. But the memory was a sliver of warmth in the crushing cold. She closed her eyes, focusing on the pain in her soul, on the empty space that screamed his name. She didn't know what she was doing, only that she had to try. She reached for that frayed, severed thread with all the strength of her will. She poured her desperation, her fear, her tiny flickering hope into that void. Cale. For a long time there was nothing, only the cold, the silence, the pain. She was about to give up, to let the darkness swallow her whole, and then she felt it. Infinitesimally faint. A distant flicker of warmth. A single, resonant note in the crushing silence. It was him. He was alive. He was fighting for her. A voice, not of sound, but of pure thought and will, echoed in the deepest part of her soul. It was weak, strained by distance and dark magic, but it was unmistakably his. Alara. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. She wasn't alone. "Hold on," the voice urged, a thread of steel running through the pain. "I feel you. Hold on. I am coming." The ritual began at dawn. Alara was unchained from the floor and dragged to the black stone altar. Her thin tunic was torn from her, leaving her in a simple linen shift, exposed and shivering. Malakor's followers chanted in a low, guttural language, the words themselves seeming to suck the warmth from the air. Malakor stood before her, holding a jagged obsidian knife. "Do not fight, little key. It will only make the pain worse." He raised the knife. He did not intend to cut her skin, but the soul. The ritual was designed to slice into the bond itself, to pry it open and attach his own dark magic to it like a parasite. As he began the incantation, the silver manacles on her wrists grew impossibly cold, the pain so intense she cried out. The void in her chest became a swirling vortex of agony. She could feel Malakor's magic, greasy and foul, probing at the edges of the severed bond. And then she felt Kael. He was close. The faint warmth she had felt before was now a growing heat, a distant wildfire racing across a frozen plain. He was coming. He was here. Just as Malakor's power was about to pierce her soul, the entire cavern shook. A deafening roar, more beast than man, echoed from the tunnels outside. It was a sound of pure apocalyptic rage, and it made the chanting of the cultists falter. The stone wall at the far end of the cavern exploded inward. Kael stood in the breach, not as a man, but as the great wolf. He was a creature of nightmare and legend, impossibly large, his black fur bristling, his lips pulled back from teeth like daggers. And his eyes were not gold. They were blazing silver fire, burning with a light so intense it cast the green torches into shadow. Behind him, his warriors poured into the cavern, a tide of gray fur and flashing steel. The battle was instant and savage. Kael's pack, the elite of the north, tore into the ranks of the Ember Covenant. Kael himself ignored everyone else. His silver eyes were locked on Alara, chained to the altar, and on Malakor, who stood between them. With another earth-shaking roar, he launched himself across the cavern. Malakor, his face pale with fury at the interruption, threw up a hand. A wall of black shadow erupted from the ground, but Kael smashed through it as if it were smoke. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of vengeance. He reached Malakor, and the two alphas clashed. It was a battle of primeval forces, the wolf's raw, physical power against the sorcerer's dark, twisting magic. Claws raked against shields of shadow, fangs snapped at bolts of black energy. Alara could only watch, helpless, her heart pounding. She saw Kael fighting, taking risks, driving himself forward with a single-minded desperation to reach her. Malakor was cunning. He used his own cultists as shields, weaving and dodging, looking for an opening. He found one. As Kael lunged, Malakor sidestepped and unleashed a vicious, barbed whip of pure shadow. It struck Kael across his flank, the same spot where he had been wounded before. The dark magic bit deep. Kael roared, a sound of fury mixed with searing pain, and he stumbled, one of his forelegs buckling. He was hurt. He was in danger. Seeing him fall, seeing his pain, something inside Alara broke. It was not a gentle crack. It was a cataclysmic shatter. All the fear, the humiliation, the pain of her entire life, all the rage at Lyra and Alaric and Malakor, all the desperate, fierce, possessive love she felt for the magnificent creature who had called her his. It all converged into a single, incandescent point. The silver manacles on her wrists did not melt. They vaporized. A wave of pure, blinding white light erupted from her. It was not fire. It was creation. It was life. It was the absolute, undeniable antithesis of Malicor's shadows. The wave expanded, silent and unstoppable. It passed over Kael, and the black, magical wound on his flank vanished, healed in an instant. It washed over his warriors, mending their cuts and bruises, filling them with renewed strength. But when it hit the Ember Covenant, it was devastation. The hooded figures screamed as the light touched them, their shadows consumed, their dark magic turning to ash. They fell, not dead, but broken, their power scoured from them. The light receded, coalescing around Alara. She was no longer shivering. She stood tall, her head held high, her body radiating a soft, white luminescence. The simple linen shift looked like a gown of starlight. The brand on her wrist was no longer silver. It was a blazing, white fire. Malicor stared at her, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. What are you?" he snarled, taking a step back. Alara met his gaze. Her eyes, the simple brown eyes of a worthless Omega, were now glowing with the same white light that surrounded her. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was calm, clear, and resonant with a power that shook the very foundations of the cavern. "I am his," she declared, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. She took a step toward Malicor, and he flinched. "And he is mine." She raised her hand, the one with the blazing mark. The light gathered at her fingertips. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a key or a vessel. She was a queen, and this was her judgment. "You called me worthless," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You tried to use me to destroy him. You are the one who is nothing." With a final declarative cry, she thrust her hand forward. A beam of concentrated, pure white light shot from her palm. It was not a weapon of anger, but of justice. It struck Malicor square in the chest. He didn't even have time to scream. The light consumed him, and where the Shadow King had stood, there was nothing left, not even ash, only the clean, cold stone of the cavern floor. The battle was over. The surviving cultists were on their knees, disarmed and powerless. Kael's warriors stood in stunned, awed silence. The white light around Alara softened, fading back into her until only the mark on her wrist glowed with a gentle, steady luminescence. The immense power retreated, leaving her swaying on her feet, utterly exhausted, but more whole than she had ever been. Kael shifted. The great wolf dissolved into the man, and he was across the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her or command her. He stopped before her, his golden eyes full of reverence and awe. He looked at her not as something he owned, but as his magnificent, terrifying, beautiful equal. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, his touch infinitely gentle. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned into his touch, a wave of relief so profound it almost brought her to her knees. "Kael." He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was both fiercely protective and achingly tender. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent. "My queen," he murmured against her scalp, the words a vow, a prayer. She clung to him, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She was safe. She was home. After a long moment, he drew back slightly, though he kept her close. He took her left hand, lifting it to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to the glowing mark on her wrist. Then, he held up his own right arm. There, burned onto his skin in lines of pale golden light, was a matching mark. A perfect mirror of her own, a celestial wolf howling at a crescent moon. It had not been there before. Her power, her claim, had put it there. Tears filled her eyes as she reached out with her free hand, her fingers tracing the new mark on his skin. The moment she touched it, both marks flared, his with golden light, hers with silver white. The bond, once severed and corrupted, snapped back into place, 1,000 times stronger than before. It was a perfect, humming circuit of power and love, a song shared between their two souls. She was not just claimed. She had claimed him in return. They returned not to the Grey Fang Keep, but to Kale's own stronghold, the Sunstone Citadel. It was a breathtaking fortress carved into the peak of the highest mountain in the north, a city of white stone and gold that seemed to catch the sunlight and hold it within its walls. Kale led her into the great throne room. Thousands of his people were assembled, warriors, elders, families, children. They filled the vast hall, their faces turned toward the dais. The air was thick with anticipation. He did not walk ahead of her or drag her behind him. He walked beside her, his hand holding hers, their steps perfectly in sync. They stopped before the twin thrones of carved mountain stone and sun crystal. He turned to face the massive assembly. His voice, amplified by the hall's acoustics and his own innate power, rang out, clear and strong. "People of the Sunstone Pack, warriors of the North," he declared. "For centuries I have led you alone. For centuries this throne has been half empty. No longer." He turned to Alara, his golden eyes soft and full of a love so profound it made her breath catch. He took her hand and raised it for all to see, the glowing marks on their wrists a testament for the entire world. "This is Alara," he announced, his voice ringing with pride. "She is the light in the shadow, the fire in the cold. She is my soul, my mate, your queen." A moment of stunned silence, and then the hall erupted. A single, unified roar of approval and joy shook the very foundations of the mountain. The sound washed over Alara, not as a threat, but as a welcome. 1,000 voices, 1,000 souls, accepting her, celebrating her. For the first time in her life, she did not feel invisible. She did not feel worthless. She felt seen, utterly and completely seen. She was not a stray, not an Omega, not a scullery maid. She was Alara, mate to the Alpha King. She was a queen. Kael squeezed her hand, his smile like the sunrise. He led her to one of the twin thrones, and she sat, the sun crystal warm against her back. He took his place beside her. Looking out at the sea of cheering faces, at the kingdom of light and strength that was now her home, she felt a peace settle deep in her soul. The cold was finally gone, banished forever by the warmth of his love and her own newfound power. She was part of a pack, part of a family. She was loved. She was home. Her hand rested in his, the matching marks on their wrists glowing with a soft, steady light, a silent promise of a shared eternity. The long winter of her life was over, and a new, brilliant spring had just begun.